May 27, 1941. Halfaya Pass, Egyptian-Libyan border. The desert night breathes differently than the day. When the sun abandons North Africa, the sand releases its stored heat in whispers, and the dunes become an ocean of shadows where sound travels with strange clarity. A cough carries 300 yards, an engine's growl becomes a phantom that circles before revealing its source. On this particular night, Lieutenant Franz Becker of the 5th Light Division stood beside his Panzer III, listening to something that violated every principle of armored warfare he had learned at Munster training grounds. His crew heard it too, the grinding mechanical rhythm approaching from the east, neither fast nor cautious, moving with an indifference that suggested either supreme confidence or ghostly ignorance of tactical doctrine. The sound grew closer. Becker raised his binoculars toward the moon-washed ridgeline and felt his chest tighten, not from fear, which would have been rational, but from disbelief. Emerging from the darkness like iron wraiths, their hulls gleaming dully under starlight, came 3 British tanks moving in perfect line abreast formation, their tracks churning sand into pale clouds, advancing as if the entire Afrika Korps were merely an inconvenience to be brushed aside. In that moment, Franz Becker understood that everything Berlin had told him about British armor was catastrophically, dangerously wrong. The Afrika Korps arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 with absolute certainty forged in the furnaces of continental triumph. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs had crushed Poland in weeks, swept through France in 40 days, and established German armored doctrine as the new gospel of modern warfare. The intelligence briefings distributed to tank commanders contained assessments of British equipment that bordered on mockery: slow Matilda infantry tanks designed for trench warfare, underpowered Crusaders plagued by mechanical unreliability, crews trained in outdated cavalry traditions rather than the integrated combined arms philosophy that had revolutionized the European battlefield. The psychological preparation was equally dismissive. British tank forces were portrayed as colonial garrison troops, gentlemen officers playing at war with obsolete equipment, an army still dreaming of Waterloo, while the Wehrmacht had already entered the age of lightning war. The desert itself seemed to confirm German confidence. Libya's coastal plains and rocky escarpments favored the superior optics of German tanks, the Zeiss rangefinders that could identify targets at ranges where British crews still saw only heat, shimmer, and dust. Rommel's arrival energized the entire theater. Here was the architect of the French collapse, a commander who understood that armored warfare was fundamentally about speed, concentration, and the psychological destruction of enemy cohesion before the first shot was fired. Supply lines stretched back across the Mediterranean. But what did logistics matter when British armor would shatter at first contact? Then came the night engagements. The first reports were dismissed as combat stress, the fevered imaginings of men driven half-mad by the desert's extremes of heat and isolation. Panzer crews described British tanks emerging from darkness at distances that should have been suicidal, their hulls absorbing 50mm armor-piercing rounds that would have gutted any French or Polish tank, continuing to advance with grinding mechanical persistence while German shells sparked off their frontal armor like matches struck against stone. The Matildas, those allegedly obsolete infantry support vehicles, mounted 80mm of frontal armor, thicker than anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in 2 years of continental warfare. The Crusaders, supposedly fragile and unreliable, demonstrated a speed across broken ground that allowed them to circle German positions in the darkness, appearing and vanishing like mechanized phantoms, exploiting the one dimension where Panzer doctrine had no answer: the moonless North African night, where superior optics meant nothing, and British crews fought with an intimate knowledge of their machines' capabilities that transcended mere technical training. The first major confrontation shattered German assumptions with the finality of a hammer against porcelain. Operation Battle Axe, launched in June 1941, was Britain's attempt to relieve Tobruk and drive the Afrika Korps back toward Tripoli. For the German tank commanders positioned along the Libyan-Egyptian frontier, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority that 2 years of uninterrupted victory had confirmed as natural law. They prepared their positions with textbook precision: hull-down placements on ridgelines interlocking fields of fire, 80-20mm anti-aircraft guns repositioned as tank destroyers, the combined arms integration that had annihilated the French armored divisions at Arras and Sedan. The British attacked at dawn on June 15th, and for the first hours, the battle proceeded exactly as German doctrine predicted. Crusader tanks racing across open ground were bracketed by 88mm fire and stopped dead, their thin side armor no match for weapons designed to kill four-engine bombers at 20,000 feet. Matildas advancing in support were methodically engaged at maximum range, their slower speed making them predictable targets. By noon, the Halfaya Pass position had destroyed 17 British tanks without losing a single panzer. Radio reports flowing back to divisional headquarters confirmed the expected narrative. British armor was brave but obsolete, their tactics suicidally aggressive, their defeat merely a matter of ammunition expenditure. Then darkness fell, and the Desert War revealed its true nature. The British tanks that had withdrawn at dusk did not retreat to defensive positions. They advanced. Matildas that had been methodically targeted during daylight hours reappeared in the darkness, their thick frontal armor now an absolute defense against hastily aimed shots from panzer crews who could no longer exploit their superior optics. The grinding roar of British tank engines surrounded German positions, coming from multiple directions simultaneously, creating acoustic confusion that made accurate fire impossible. German tank commanders trained to fight in the clear sight lines of European plains discovered that their entire tactical vocabulary was useless in an environment where visual identification became possible only at ranges where British guns could penetrate German armor. Lieutenant Becker's crew fired 9 rounds at shadows that night. 8 missed completely. The 9th struck a Matilda's frontal glacis and ricocheted into the darkness with a sound like a bell being struck in a cathedral. The British tank continued advancing, its commander presumably unaware that he had even been engaged. At 0300 hours, Becker received orders to withdraw. The retreat was not strategic repositioning, it was flight. The intelligence reassessment that followed Battle Axe represented the first crack in the psychological armor that had protected the Afrika Korps since its arrival in North Africa. Technical officers from the 5th Light Division stripped down captured Matilda tanks and submitted reports that read like confessions of institutional blindness. The British infantry tank was not an obsolete relic. It was a mobile fortress designed around a tactical philosophy fundamentally different from German doctrine. Where panzers prioritized mobility and shock, the Matilda embodied patient, methodical dominance of terrain. Its 80mm frontal armor could only be penetrated by 88mm guns or point-blank shots to side armor, and its 2-pounder gun, while lacking the high explosive capability of German weapons, fired armor-piercing rounds with devastating accuracy at close range. In the constricted terrain of desert passes and in nighttime engagements where the battle compressed into knife-fighting distances, the Matilda became nearly invulnerable. The Crusader presented a different nightmare. British crews pushed their supposedly unreliable tanks beyond all reasonable mechanical limits, conducting approach marches of 70 miles across trackless desert, arriving at engagement zones exhausted but operational, demonstrating a level of mechanical improvisation that German maintenance officers found incomprehensible. How did British crews keep Christie suspension systems functional in an environment of pulverizing sand and extreme thermal cycles? The answer lay not in superior engineering but in superior intimacy. British tank crews treated their vehicles as living things, learning individual mechanical personalities, developing intuitive understanding of sounds and vibrations that warned of impending failure. German doctrine emphasized standardization and interchangeability. British crews achieved reliability through relationship, but the most disturbing revelation was tactical. The British had developed a night-fighting doctrine specifically optimized for the desert environment, treating darkness not as an obstacle but as a tactical dimension to be exploited. They used moonless nights for approach marches, navigated by stars and dead reckoning with accuracy that rivaled daylight map reading, and positioned tanks in defensive lagers that became fortified strongpoints after dark. German tanks, with their superior daytime optics, became nearly blind in darkness, while British crews fighting at close range needed only to identify silhouettes against the star-washed horizon. The psychological effect was profound. German tank commanders accustomed to dominating the battlefield through technological superiority now faced an enemy that negated that advantage for 12 hours of every day. Sleep became fitful, nerves frayed, and the desert night, once merely uncomfortable, became a source of creeping dread. The psychological fractures deepened through the summer of 1941 as the British Western Desert Force demonstrated capabilities that violated every assumption embedded in Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. German tank crews began reporting phenomena that their training had not prepared them to process. British tanks advancing through direct fire that should have destroyed them, absorbing hits that would have catastrophically killed any Panzer III, and continuing to fight with mechanical persistence that seemed almost inhuman. Crews described watching armor-piercing rounds strike Matilda frontal plates and ricochet skyward, leaving only bright scars on steel that refused to yield. The sound of those deflected shots, a harsh metallic scream followed by the whistling departure of the round into darkness, became audible confirmation of impotence. The stress manifested in unexpected ways. Experienced tank commanders began refusing night deployments, citing mechanical problems that maintenance crews could never verify. Others requested transfers to units facing Soviet forces, where at least the enemy followed comprehensible tactical patterns and could be killed with weapons that actually worked. Letters home, monitored by military sensors, revealed a growing crisis of confidence. One Panzer commander wrote to his wife, "We are fighting ghosts that our guns cannot hurt. The British tanks come in the darkness, and we fire until our ammunition is exhausted, and still they advance." I do not know how to explain this to Berlin because I barely understand it myself. Rommel responded with characteristic aggression, demanding increased night patrols and offensive operations designed to seize initiative and deny the British their preferred tactical environment. The results were catastrophic. German tank crews operating in darkness without adequate training or doctrine blundered into prepared British positions and were destroyed at close range by 2-pounder guns firing from hull-down positions they could not identify until shells began tearing through their side armor. One engagement near Sidi Rezeg saw an entire panzer company destroyed in 30 minutes of confused nighttime fighting. 13 tanks eliminated without the British suffering a single loss. The survivors reported the same details: the grinding mechanical approach, the sudden muzzle flashes that seemed to erupt from empty desert, the impotent clanging of their own rounds bouncing off British armor, and then the penetrating hits that turned panzer interiors into furnaces. The desert night, once neutral terrain, had become Britain's tactical domain, and German crews were dying to prove it. Something fundamental had to change, or the Africa Corps would bleed out one moonless night at a time. The logistical dimension of the Desert War revealed another British advantage that German intelligence had catastrophically underestimated: the industrial and supply infrastructure supporting the 8th Army's tank forces. While the Africa Corps depended on supply lines stretching across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to Royal Navy interdiction and RAF bombing, British forces in Egypt operated from a developed rear area that included maintenance facilities, spare parts depots, and a steady flow of replacement tanks from British factories and American Lend-Lease production. The mathematical implications were brutal. For every Matilda destroyed in combat, 2 more arrived in Alexandria the following week. For every Panzer III lost, replacement depended on a cargo ship successfully running the gauntlet from Italy to Tripoli. British tank workshops in Cairo and Alexandria operated on a scale that German officers found difficult to comprehend. Damaged Matildas and Crusaders were not abandoned as total losses but recovered from battlefields, transported hundreds of miles to rear area facilities, and rebuilt with industrial efficiency. Tanks that would have been written off as scrap under German logistics protocols were returned to combat status within weeks, their battle damage patched, engines replaced, and crews reassigned. This created a force multiplication effect that transcended mere numerical superiority. British tank units developed institutional knowledge and combat experience that survived individual vehicle losses. The Germans attempted to compensate through tactical innovation. Rommel personally supervised the integration of 88mm anti-aircraft guns into frontline defensive positions, creating hybrid strongpoints where high-velocity guns could kill Matildas at ranges beyond the effective reach of British tank guns. The tactic worked, but only during daylight hours and only when British commanders obliged by attacking prepared positions. Increasingly, the British refused to play by German rules. They conducted reconnaissance in force, identified 80mm positions through observation of muzzle flash and trajectory, and either bypassed the strong points entirely or suppressed them with artillery before committing tanks. The campaign became a war of industrial attrition overlaid with tactical chess, and the British were winning both games. German situation reports began including increasingly desperate requests for tank reinforcements, 80mm guns, ammunition, fuel, everything necessary to sustain operations against an enemy that seemed capable of absorbing losses indefinitely while inflicting irreplaceable damage on Axis forces. One staff officer summarized the situation in a classified memo. "We are fighting the entire industrial capacity of the British Empire, supplied by American production, while subsisting on whatever the Italian Navy manages to deliver. The mathematics are unfavorable." By autumn 1941, the psychological toll of fighting an enemy that dominated the darkness had created a moral crisis within the Afrika Korps that transcended tactical concerns. Tank commanders faced impossible choices: obey orders to maintain aggressive patrolling during nighttime hours and risk catastrophic losses to an enemy they could not effectively engage, or conserve forces through passive defense and face court-martial for cowardice. There was no good answer, only gradations of failure and death. Lieutenant Becker embodied this dilemma. On the night of October 14th, his platoon received orders to conduct a reconnaissance in force toward British positions near Sidi Omar. The mission parameters were clear: advance under darkness, locate British defensive positions, engage if favorable tactical conditions existed, withdraw before dawn. Becker understood that these orders were functionally suicidal. British forces in the area included at least 2 Matilda squadrons, and nighttime engagement meant fighting at ranges where German guns were ineffective, while British 2-pounders could penetrate Panzer side armor with mechanical certainty. He had 2 options. He could refuse the order, cite mechanical problems or navigation difficulties, and preserve his crew for another day. This would mean abandoning comrades in adjacent units who were depending on his reconnaissance intelligence, and it would likely result in disciplinary action that could end his military career. Or he could obey, lead his tanks into the darkness, and accept the probability that some or all of his crews would die in a firefight they could not win. Becker chose duty. His platoon advanced at 2200 hours, navigating by compass and dead reckoning across terrain that looked identical in every direction under starlight. At 2347 hours, they encountered the British position, not through visual identification, but through the sudden eruption of muzzle flashes that lit the desert like flashbulbs, followed by the metallic shriek of armor-piercing rounds tearing through steel. Becker's Panzer III took a hit through the turret ring that killed his gunner instantly and filled the interior with smoke and blood. The second round penetrated the engine compartment and ignited fuel lines, giving the crew 14 seconds to evacuate before the ammunition cooked off. 4 men escaped. 1 did not. The platoon lost 3 tanks in 5 minutes of combat. British losses, 0. Becker sat in the sand 300 yards from his burning tank, watching flames rise into the desert sky, and understood with perfect clarity that courage and discipline were not sufficient advantages against an enemy that controlled the dimension of darkness itself. Something deeper than tactics was required. A fundamental reimagining of how armored warfare could be fought in an environment that nullified every German advantage. The German response to the night fighting crisis emerged not from high command directives, but from desperate innovation by frontline crews who understood that survival required adaptation beyond doctrine. Tank commanders began developing unofficial tactics that would have been considered cowardice in any other theater, abandoning hull-down positions before darkness fell, withdrawing to rear areas during moonless nights, using extensive camouflage to avoid detection rather than relying on superior firepower. These were not the tactics of the Blitzkrieg, they were the tactics of the hunted. Simultaneously, German intelligence operations intensified efforts to understand British tank doctrine at a granular level. Interrogations of captured British crews revealed a training system fundamentally different from Wehrmacht standardization. British tank commanders emphasized individual initiative and intimate knowledge of specific vehicles over procedural uniformity. Crews named their tanks, personalized interiors, and developed mechanical relationships that bordered on the superstitious. A Matilda commander captured near Tobruk explained his tank's reliability through a combination of technical maintenance and what he called knowing her moods, an approach that German technical officers initially dismissed as unscientific nonsense, but gradually came to recognize as a form of expertise their own training had never developed. The British night fighting advantage extended beyond equipment to doctrine. They used darkness not merely as concealment, but as an active tactical element, timing operations to coincide with optimal lunar conditions, using star navigation with accuracy that rivaled daytime map reading, and coordinating multi-unit movements through radio discipline and prearranged signals. German intercepted communications revealed another disturbing capability. British forces could distinguish individual German units by sound signature alone, identifying specific panzer companies by the acoustic characteristics of their engines and tracks. In darkness, the British were fighting with senses German crews had never trained. November 1941 brought Operation Crusader, Britain's largest offensive to date, and German forces faced coordinated armor attacks that combined daylight artillery preparation with nighttime tank exploitation. The battle revealed the full maturity of British desert warfare doctrine: infantry establishing positions during darkness, armor advancing at dawn supported by artillery that had registered targets during previous daylight hours, and continuous pressure that prevented German forces from reorganizing between engagements. The Afrika Korps fought with characteristic ferocity, but ferocity was insufficient against an enemy that had mastered industrial warfare's fundamental principle: relentless, methodical application of superior resources, coordinated through doctrine specifically optimized for the operational environment. The Desert War had become Britain's laboratory, and German forces were the test subjects proving which tactical theories survived contact with reality. The convergence point arrived in the winter darkness of December 1941, when parallel evolutions in both British capability and German desperation created conditions for a confrontation that would fundamentally redefine the Desert War's psychological landscape. British forces had refined their night-fighting doctrine to a level of sophistication that integrated tank operations with artillery support, infantry coordination, and air reconnaissance in ways that Wehrmacht combined arms theory had described, but never fully achieved. Meanwhile, German crews had developed counter-tactics born from survival necessity: extensive use of flares to illuminate British positions, coordinated withdrawal procedures that preserved force integrity, and increasing reliance on anti-tank guns positioned in depth rather than exposed armor. The revelatory engagement occurred near Bir el Gubi on December 6th, when a British armored column conducting a nighttime approach march encountered a German position that had been preparing for exactly this scenario for 3 weeks. The Germans had positioned captured British vehicles around their defensive perimeter to confuse acoustic identification, scattered retroreflective panels to create false tank signatures when illuminated by flares, and established interlocking fields of fire that created kill zones invisible until British tanks entered them. The result was the first major British night-fighting defeat of the Desert War: 11 Crusaders and 4 Matildas destroyed in 40 minutes of combat that saw German forces finally achieve the defensive cohesion necessary to neutralize British darkness advantage. But the tactical victory revealed a strategic problem. The defensive posture that allowed Germans to survive nighttime engagements prevented the offensive operations that Rommel's entire campaign strategy depended upon. The Afrika Korps could now avoid catastrophic night losses, but only by surrendering initiative and accepting a fundamentally reactive operational stance. The British, meanwhile, adapted with characteristic pragmatism, shifting to mixed tactics that combined daylight artillery bombardment with night armor exploitation, forcing German forces to defend continuously without respite. The intelligence picture became clearer through analysis of captured British planning documents. The Western Desert Force was operating under a long-term strategy of attrition, accepting tactical losses in exchange for strategic exhaustion of German logistics. Every night engagement, regardless of immediate outcome, forced the Afrika Korps to expend fuel, ammunition, and irreplaceable mechanical lifespan on their tank fleet. The British could afford attrition. The Germans could not. The Desert War had become a mathematics problem, and both sides understood which variables were shifting in whose favor. The question was no longer whether German forces could win decisive victories, but whether they could survive long enough for external strategic developments to change the fundamental calculus. The preparation for endgame began in the spring of 1942 as both forces consolidated lessons learned and positioned for decisive confrontation. The British had perfected a doctrinal approach that treated the desert as a three-dimensional battlefield, where temporal control of darkness mattered as much as spatial control of terrain. Their training exercises now routinely included night navigation, close-range tank gunnery under starlight conditions, and coordination between armor and artillery that allowed British forces to maintain operational tempo across complete 24-hour cycles. The Eighth Army was no longer fighting to survive darkness. It was fighting to weaponize it. German responses evolved along two parallel tracks. Tactically, Afrika Korps units developed sophisticated defensive procedures that emphasized mobility over positional strength, using the desert's vast spaces to avoid rather than contest British nighttime advantages. Panzer companies learned to conduct tactical withdrawals that preserved force integrity, establishing temporary defensive positions at dusk and relocating under darkness to new positions miles away, denying British forces the static targets their artillery and armor coordination required. Strategically, Rommel lobbied Berlin for resources that might restore offensive capability, more 80mm guns, improved ammunition, and above all, the tank reinforcements necessary to absorb losses and maintain combat power. The requests were partially granted. New Panzer IIIs arrived with upgraded 50mm guns capable of penetrating Matilda armor at closer ranges, and increased allocations of 88mm weapons allowed for denser defensive networks. But the fundamental arithmetic remained unfavorable. British industrial capacity continued producing tanks faster than German logistics could deliver replacements to North Africa, and the Mediterranean supply lines were deteriorating under intensified Royal Navy and RAF operations. Each cargo ship that failed to reach Tripoli represented tanks, fuel, and ammunition that would never reinforce the Africa Corps. Lieutenant Becker, now promoted to Hauptmann and commanding a full tank company, recognized the inevitability with the clarity of someone who had watched too many comrades burn in darkness. He wrote in his journal, "We have learned to fight at night. We have learned to survive the British tactics, but survival is not victory, and learning is not winning. Every engagement we survive diminishes us, while every loss they suffer is replaced within weeks. The desert teaches patience to those who would live, but we are not here to live. We are here to win. And winning, I increasingly suspect, requires more than courage or tactical skill. It requires what we do not have: time, logistics, and the industrial capacity to sustain losses indefinitely." The assessment was accurate. The final confrontation was approaching. The direct confrontation that had been building since the first ghostly encounters of 1941 arrived in the form of Operation Crusader's final phase, when British forces committed to a coordinated offensive designed to exploit every tactical advantage they had developed through 18 months of desert warfare. The attack combined overwhelming artillery preparation, daylight armor advances supported by air superiority, and nighttime exploitation phases where Matildas and Crusaders operated in the darkness with the confidence of predators hunting familiar terrain. German forces fought with desperate skill, employing every defensive innovation they had developed. But the mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Hauptmann Becker's company entered the engagement with 14 operational tanks. After 72 hours of continuous combat, a grinding cycle of daylight defensive stands, nighttime withdrawals, hasty repositioning, and renewed British attacks that allowed no rest or reorganization, he commanded 6. The losses were not catastrophic failures but slow mechanical and human erosion. Tanks damaged beyond field repair, crews exhausted beyond safe operation, ammunition expenditure that could not be replenished, fuel consumption that drained reserves faster than supply convoys could replace them. The British accepted similar loss rates, but British losses were replaced within weeks, while German losses were permanent. The psychological breaking point came on the third night, when Becker's remaining tanks were conducting a withdrawal toward prepared positions and encountered a British armored column that had apparently been tracking their movement for hours. The engagement was brief and decisive, 3 Panzer IIIs destroyed in the opening volley, the survivors scattering into the darkness in individual flight rather than coordinated retreat. Becker's tank survived through chance rather than skill, a navigation error that took them south of the engagement zone, while British forces concentrated on the main body. At dawn, he rendezvoused with the scattered remnants of his company and conducted an assessment that confirmed what intuition had already reported. They were no longer an effective combat unit. 3 operational tanks, crews suffering from exhaustion-induced hallucinations, ammunition reduced to fewer than 30 rounds per vehicle, fuel sufficient for perhaps 50 kilometers of movement. The company that had arrived in North Africa certain of technological and tactical superiority had been reduced to a fugitive force surviving through evasion and luck. The British tanks that had seemed like ghostly phantoms in 1941 had become mechanical inevitabilities in 1942, not supernatural, but simply better suited to the environment and backed by industrial resources that could not be matched. The Desert War's verdict was no longer in doubt. The apex of the Desert Campaign's psychological transformation arrived not in a single climactic battle, but in the accumulated weight of countless night engagements that had fundamentally restructured how German tank crews understood their place in the war's larger narrative. The invincibility that had sustained the Wehrmacht through 2 years of continental triumph had dissolved in the North African darkness, replaced by a hard-won realism that recognized British tank forces as equals, and in the specific dimension of nighttime armored warfare, as superiors whose advantages could be mitigated but not overcome. The final illumination came through captured British after-action reports that revealed how completely the Eighth Army had systematized night-fighting doctrine. What German crews had experienced as almost supernatural tactical ability was actually methodical training, rigorous maintenance procedures, and operational planning that treated darkness as a tactical asset to be exploited, rather than an obstacle to be endured. British tank commanders received specific instruction in star navigation, close-range night gunnery, and coordinated movement under blackout conditions. Their vehicles were maintained to standards that prioritized operational reliability over maximum performance, accepting slightly reduced specifications in exchange for mechanical dependability that allowed sustained operations across multi-day campaigns. The ghostly tanks that had traumatized German crews were simply well-maintained Matildas and Crusaders, operated by thoroughly trained crews executing doctrine specifically optimized for the desert environment. The realization was simultaneously humbling and liberating. Humbling because it confirmed that German tactical superiority was not an inherent quality, but a contextual advantage that evaporated when fighting enemies who had adapted to specific environmental conditions. Liberating because it meant British successes were comprehensible and potentially replicable, rather than mysteriously inexplicable. The Afrika Korps had not been defeated by supernatural forces but by professional soldiers who had learned their craft more thoroughly in the specific context of desert warfare. Hauptmann Becker, commanding his reduced company in the withdrawal toward El Agheila, watched a column of replacement Matildas moving up toward the front lines and felt something unexpected, professional respect bordering on admiration. The British had entered the Desert War with equipment considered obsolete by German standards and tactics derided as cavalry romanticism, and they had systematically transformed both into weapons systems optimized for the operational environment. They had learned faster, adapted more thoroughly, and maintained logistical systems that sustained learning across the entire force. The desert had been their classroom, and they had earned their mastery through disciplined study of a curriculum written in sand, darkness, and mechanical reliability. The war was far from over, but the lesson was complete. The revelatory moment transcended tactical considerations and touched upon fundamental questions of military philosophy and national character. The Desert War had become a laboratory where competing visions of armored warfare were tested against the unforgiving empiricism of actual combat, and the results contradicted every assumption that had powered the Wehrmacht's continental victories. German doctrine had emphasized speed, shock, and the psychological destruction of enemy cohesion through rapid maneuver, principles perfectly suited to the roads and open plains of France and Poland, but profoundly inadequate for an environment where logistics trumped mobility and mechanical reliability mattered more than maximum performance. The British approach, initially dismissed as hopelessly outdated, proved devastatingly effective precisely because it prioritized sustainability over dramatic operational tempo. Matilda tanks were slow, but their mechanical simplicity allowed them to remain operational across campaigns that reduced faster Crusaders to maintenance nightmares. British crews were trained in individualized vehicle knowledge rather than standardized procedures, creating relationships between men and machines that allowed for field repairs and improvised solutions that German technical manuals never contemplated. The night-fighting doctrine that seemed almost supernatural was simply systematic exploitation of an environmental variable that German training had treated as a mere inconvenience. The moral weight of this realization was profound. German tank crews had not failed through lack of courage or dedication. They had fought with extraordinary bravery against an enemy that often possessed superior tactical positioning and numerical advantage. They had not failed through inferior equipment. Panzer IIIs and IVs were excellent tanks when operated within their designed parameters. They had failed through institutional arrogance that treated the desert as just another operational theater, rather than a unique environment requiring fundamental doctrinal adaptation. The British had learned. The Germans had assumed. The difference was written in burned-out panzers scattered across 600 miles of North African sand. Hauptmann Becker, conducting his final situation report before the withdrawal toward Tunisia, included an assessment that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. British tank forces have demonstrated tactical and operational capabilities equal or superior to our own in nighttime engagement scenarios. Their integration of armor, artillery, and logistics represents a maturation of desert warfare doctrine that we have not matched. Recommend comprehensive review of training and tactical procedures before resuming offensive operations. The report was filed, read, and quietly ignored, but the truth it contained was already spreading through the Africa Corps like a contagion, transforming certainty into doubt and revealing that the ghostly British tanks had been flesh and steel all along, just better prepared. The Desert War continued through 1942 and into 1943. Its ultimate conclusion, determined by industrial capacity and strategic logistics rather than tactical virtuosity, but the psychological transformation it wrought upon those who fought in the darkness remained. Veterans of the Africa Corps who survived to fight in Italy and France carried with them a hard-earned respect for British armored forces that other Wehrmacht units, still intoxicated by early war successes, could not comprehend. They had learned what continental victories had never taught, that technological advantage was contextual, that courage was insufficient against systematic preparation, and that the enemy who adapts learns faster than the enemy who assumes. The British Matilda and Crusader tanks that had seemed like mechanical ghosts in 1941 were retired from frontline service by 1943, replaced by American Shermans and improved British designs that incorporated lessons learned in the desert laboratory. But their legacy persisted in the training manuals and tactical doctrines that emphasized night fighting capability, mechanical reliability, and the integration of armor with supporting arms. The Eighth Army that eventually drove Axis forces from North Africa and fought through Italy to the Alps was fundamentally shaped by the night battles of 1941-42, when supposedly obsolete tanks, operated by cavalry-trained crews, had proven that institutional learning trumped initial technological advantage. For the German crews who faced those ghostly tanks in darkness, the experience provided education that transcended military doctrine and touched upon deeper truths about hubris, adaptation, and the limits of confidence unsupported by empirical verification. They had arrived in Africa as conquerors, certain of superiority confirmed by 2 years of uninterrupted triumph. They departed as students who had learned that warfare's classroom admits no graduates, only those who continue studying and those who fail. The desert taught patience, humility, and respect for enemies who refused to conform to assumptions. Those who learned survived. Those who did not became statistics in after-action reports, their tanks abandoned to the sand and wind. The night still falls across North Africa, with the same whispered release of stored heat, the same acoustic clarity that carries sound across impossible distances. But the grinding mechanical rhythm that once inspired terror in German tank crews has faded into history, leaving only the lesson it taught, that ghosts are often just enemies we failed to understand, and understanding requires the humility to learn from those we assumed we had already surpassed. The desert remembers. The survivors remember. The lesson endures.